welcome to the second episode of our series. We're walking you through how to build an advanced application. More specifically, we're walking you through how to build a social network. This episode is going to be kind of like a standalone, so you don't have to be following along with the whole series. In this episode, we're going to talk about how do you think through the design process, how do you identify what tools and frameworks and databases you should be using, so you don't have to be following along with the series, but if you do, this is going to be an awesome addition to your portfolio. Eventually, this app is going to have multiple databases, a fully robust RESTful API, user authentication. So this is going to be exactly the kind of application that you need to impress the pants off of employers. Let's get to it. As you think through the design of any application, there are a few questions you need to consider. The most important question is, what is the app that you're building? And you should be able to describe it in 1 to 3 sentences. The second question you want to ask is, what are the functional requirements? And as you think through the functional requirements of your application, you want to consider what kind of design will you go with, a monolithic or a microservices design? How will you communicate with your services? Will it be over HTTP through APIs? Also, what database or databases will you use? Are they going to be relational, NoSQL, graph databases, or a mix, as you will see us use? Lastly, what languages, tools, and frameworks will you use? Here's the app that we're going to use as our example. We're building a social networking application to connect people interested in fitness. Users should be able to search for each other, add friends, and create posts about their workouts. All right, so if we break those functional requirements down, we'll list them as create accounts, view feeds, create a post with pictures or texts, right? You should be able to search for users and add friends as you search for those users. Okay, we now know what application we're building, and we have a good understanding of the functional requirements, at least at this point. Let's go back and look at the 4 questions we need to consider as we design our application. The 4 questions we need to consider are: 1, will you go with a monolithic design or use microservices? 2, how will you communicate with your services? And how will those services communicate with one another? 3, what database or databases are you going to use? Will you use relational databases? Or are you going to use NoSQL, graph databases? As I said earlier, we're going to use a mix. 4, what languages, tools, and frameworks will you use? Now, we could have an entire video on the difference between and the benefits between a monolithic design versus microservices, but let's talk about this at a high level so we don't end up adding another 20 minutes to this video. Monolithic architecture is great for small applications like a notes application or a contacts app. They're also great for deploying quickly when you're starting off a new project. In fact, even at enterprise level companies, you'll often see organizations starting off with a monolithic design and then converting that into a microservices architecture. Microservices, on the other hand, are great for large applications. They're also great for independent scaling, right? So you can build out one application completely, one part of your application completely independently from another part of it. They're also great for isolating service failures. So for example, let's say your authentication service fails. Users are no longer able to log in and log out. But when you keep the parts of your application separate from one another, even if authentication fails, users can still create new accounts, right? And maybe users who are already logged in are still able to continue using the application as expected. We're going to go with the microservices design for our application, but before we talk about the different microservices we'll use, let's go back to the functional requirements and use that to help us identify what microservices we should add. So again, our functional requirements: users should be able to create accounts, In other words, they should also be able to log in, right? That's kind of implied if users should be able to create accounts. They should be able to view some kind of news feed. They should be able to create posts that include pictures as well as text. They should be able to search for users and then add those users as friends. And that's going to look more like Facebook, where when you add a friend, you're both connected, as opposed to something like Instagram, where you can follow one person, but they don't necessarily have to follow you back. That's going to make a difference. Okay, let's look at our microservices. So we'll have a user service, which will include CRUD operations on users. We'll have an authentication service, which will handle logging in and logging out. It will also generate tokens. We'll have a post service. This will include CRUD operations for users' posts. It'll also handle likes and comments on a post. We'll have a friend service. This will allow users to search for friends and also connect to friends and manage those connections. Lastly, we'll have a newsfeed service. This will generate a newsfeed by posts from friends. Here's a high-level diagram of the design. I've talked before about the importance of considering the design of your application before just diving into your code. Another problem that people have is they go to the other extreme where they spend all this time designing an application, learning everything that they possibly can about how to design applications, and they never end up actually creating the application. So we're going to keep this high level. And as we build out each piece of this, we'll dive into more detail about what the design of that piece of the application should look like. Uh, so far, we've talked about the functional design, but we also need to think through the non-functional design, right? Are you going to have elastic load balancers? Are you going to need a Redis cache for data you need to access more quickly, right? But we'll think through those aspects of our application design down the line. For now, let's look at the high level design. So we have a user connecting to the following services: a friend service, a newsfeed service, post service, authentication service, and a user service. The first part of our application we're going to work on is the user service. So a user should be able to create accounts and manage that account, right? The user service will talk to a user's database. Once we complete that task, then we'll work on the authentication service. We'll talk more about how the authentication service works once we get to that point, and we'll refer back to this diagram so we know what we're talking about. We'll also have a post service that connects to 3 different databases. We'll have a posts database for which we use MySQL. We'll have an image objects database. For that, we're going to use something like an S3 bucket, an AWS S3 bucket that is actually capable of storing objects. And then we'll also have the post service connect to a post interactions database. And I used curly braces here to show that we're going to use a NoSQL database, probably MongoDB or something like that. The reason for this is if you think about comments on a post, people can reply to comments, right? So you kind of have this nested comments inside of a post. For something like replies to comments, that's much easier to navigate through for a NoSQL database than it is for a SQL database. We could use a SQL database for this, but it's just simpler to use something like MongoDB or some other NoSQL database. Next, we have a newsfeed service. This will be gathered at the time that a user logs in. This is going to be their dashboard, right? So the user service is going to connect to 2 different databases. One, it'll connect to the connections database. This is going to be a graph database. So we can actually have data that is connected to one another, right? In the way that friends are. So the newsfeed service will identify the connections that a user has, and then it'll also talk to the post service to grab the posts from their friends. Next, we have a friends service. This will talk to the user service. You can see that loop going all the way around. So it talks to the user service to identify who the user is, and then it'll also identify the connections for a given user. Okay, as we build out each part of our application, we're going to continue referring back to that diagram. So if you didn't memorize it, that's fine. In the next video, we're going to start with the user service. We'll go over what the database looks like for the user service, and then we'll talk about the RESTful API that we'll create for it. All right, if you're interested in the rest of this series, make sure you hit the like and subscribe buttons so you can follow through. It also helps our channel out. And if you're interested in Ethno Tech Academy's coding bootcamps, check the description below. I'll see you in the next video.